So far in this chapter, we have looked at functions. We've uncovered things such as function scope, lexical scope, and function closures. And we're going to take this one step further by learning how to pass a function in JavaScript as a function argument. So in fact, we'll be passing through a whole function through another function, and we're going to work out how to internally invoke that function and pass some further information down to it. Now, this is a really nice pattern, and it may be that you use APIs from perhaps an external library in the future, or you've already done it where you would call a function which is exposed to you, and you may have some kind of callback function. Now, when we pass a function through as an argument, this is typically called a callback function. Now, if you've explored Node.js before, you'll be very used to using callbacks, whether you knew it was called that or not. So what we're going to do in this example is create a function. Now, we're going to use our car part ID example again, but instead of just this name, we're also going to pass in fn, which I'm going to call short for function. Now, like we have done before, we're going to have the ID. We will use a string literal, and we're going to have car underscore part. Now, instead of passing through the random hash, we're just going to hard code it because we're not demonstrating that in this video. So we're just going to simply pass it through. Now, what we want to do is return some kind of information so we can give the person using our function the ability to pass a function in. Now, before we go any further with this, we'll go and set up our function to kind of give us an idea about what it looks like. So what we're going to say is the constant, we're going to call this the car part, is going to be the returned value of our car part ID function call. So here we're going to define the left door, and it might be that we define afterwards a right door. So what we want to do, instead of passing something like a string through, we can pass a function. Now, as we know already, this function does not have a name, therefore it is an anonymous function, which we already covered. So inside of here, if we go console log, I am the callback function, what we can now do, because we've got this fn inside of here, is we can go and call that function inside of here. Now, before we do, let's comment out our ID and also get rid of this momentarily. Now, you can keep yours if you like because we're going to come back to it, but we just want to demonstrate this example. So you can see here we have this car part ID, which takes a name. We're not using the name just yet, but we are using our function. Now, because we are passing a function through, this is kind of similar to where we were console logging a function definition earlier on, and we could see the function string signature in the console. Now, because the function's coming through as a parameter, we can call it anything we want. So we could rename this to something else. We could name it foo or even bar, which are typical common placeholder words that we would use to explain simple concepts. Now, I typically like to keep these as fn for function. It's very nice and clear, and I'm not the only one who adopts this approach. Now, the interesting part comes through when we want to pass this constant through to our callback function. So let's have a look. Let's uncomment this. Let's take the ID and simply pass it into our function. Now, if we hit save, nothing is going to change over on the right-hand side, but we get some different behavior now because we're now invoking our anonymous function over here with a parameter, with an argument. We're passing an argument in. So that means that this function now needs to take a parameter. So we're going to say that this parameter is called ID, and instead of having this I am the callback function, we're going to have the car part ID, and then we'll just interpolate that ID. So let's save this out and see what it gives us. So there we have it. We have some hidden variable inside this car part ID scope, and we're actually passing it back in through the function argument. And as we know, we can have as many arguments as we like. We could pass some further information. We could pass the name through if we wanted to. But the interesting piece is that we are finding the car part function. We're passing in the name of it, Now we're not using the name yet, but we'll fix that momentarily. And then we're having a function which is registered as a callback. And the key here is this function isn't going to get executed until this function is in fact called. So if we were to comment out the code, our function never gets called. This fn inside of here doesn't get invoked. So let's go ahead and finish things off. What I want to do is use another ES6 string literal, and we're also going to append our name to it. So then we'll get a car part ID with that unique hash, and we also have that left door. Now we're passing this in here, and we get the whole ID back as a callback. Now this is really interesting because if we go back to our initial example, we had the car part was then equal to this car part ID. So let's take this and just console log it out. When we save things, we see undefined as the value, which we don't really want. So once this code has been executed, we register the left door, the function is then called. It would be a good idea at this point in time to perform some further logic inside this callback function. So it could be that in a real world scenario, we get past multiple elements through the parameters, and then we conduct some additional logic inside of here. Now the additional logic is simply me adding this as part of a car part ID string. Now, because I'm returning this value, but we can't return this value because if we hit save, we see undefined. Now, why do we see undefined? Because we are having our function definition, our function is getting called, but we're not returning anything. Now, the interesting piece is if we console logged inside of here, we would actually see the full definition of what we want. So we have that car part ID. So it's actually the culprit to our bug, if we want to call it a bug, as we decipher and how things work. It's because this function is not returning anything. So if we did in fact want our callback to be able to return something, we can say we want to return the function. This function then gets called and is returned as part of the result here. So when we save this out, our undefined disappears, and then we see our car part ID with the left door as we like. Now, if that all makes sense, click through to the next video. Otherwise, I'm going to do a quick recap of what's happened here. So from the top, we have created a function. We've asked for a name. We have specified that we want a function to be passed through as a parameter. We then invoked our car part ID function with a new part of left door, and we've registered a callback function, which will just let this function call it once it's ready. But once it does, we want to return the car part ID to this function. So when this function gets invoked, this ES6 string literal gets returned to this function, and then our car part ID returns the result of that. So there's a chain of events that are happening here. Now the really cool piece is how we are invoking the function inside of this function, but we're also passing some ID parameters down, as you can see here where we have this ID. Now we could call this whatever we like as well, but we're simply interpolating it here. So that's a nice recap. In the next video, we're going to talk more about something which we haven't really covered yet, but it's really important to fully understanding and mastering JavaScript, and that is the this keyword. So I'll see you in the next video.